In the 1950s, there was a polio epidemic in the UK. And when he was 4 years old, my dad got it. He was the youngest of 5 children at the time, although my grandparents went on to have another 2 sons after Dad was ill, meaning that he was one of 7, 6 brothers and a sister. But Dad was the only person in the household to get polio. He had a pretty severe speech impediment as a child, and the best guess was that he contracted polio while at his speech therapy sessions. But in any case, it was somewhat miraculous that no one else in his family contracted it too. His mother, my nana, kept a diary all her life, and my dad's brother John has done an amazing job of writing up their family history, which includes some very moving sections about the time that Dad spent in hospital when he first contracted polio, and actually the time he spent in hospital throughout his childhood. The end result of his polio was that he lived with a permanent disability, and he wore a caliper for the rest of his life. I had the opportunity recently to speak to Daryl Beeton, a disabled artist and activist who, like Dad, wore a caliper as a child. We talked about Dad's experience of growing up with a disability, and about Daryl's, as well as the need for inclusivity across the arts. I hope you enjoy it, and please do check out Daryl's work and the work of IAN, the International Inclusive Arts Network, and Assisters UK afterwards if you aren't already familiar with them.
An interview with Kate Robinson and Daryl Beeton, a contribution to the celebration of the life and works of Professor Sir Ken Robinson. Imagine If, from IAN, the International Inclusive Arts Network, and Assisters UK.
Hello everybody, my name is Daryl Beeton. I'm a disabled producer, director and performer, predominantly working in theatre for young audiences. I'm also one of the co-founding members of IAN, which is the International Inclusive Arts Network. And today I'm talking to our special guest, Kate Robinson. So welcome, Kate. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me, Daryl.
No, it's an honour. Just that Kate is the daughter of the late, great Professor Ken Robinson. And this interview is really to celebrate the project that's set up in his memory, Imagine If. But first, Kate, for those that don't know about Ken, could you tell us a bit about your father and why he's so special to so many people?
So Dad was an educator and an educationalist, a speaker and a writer. He's from Liverpool, so we were based in the UK. He was at Warwick University for a number of years, during which time he did something in the UK in 1999 called All Our Futures, which was a report commissioned by the Labour government at the time, which looked at the role in creativity across schools, and has always been a very staunch advocate for promoting particularly the arts across education. We moved to America when I was 12, so in 2001, and he did a TED Talk in 2006 called Do Schools Kill Creativity, which is still the most watched TED Talk of all time, and it has never not been, since it was one of the first TED Talks that they did put up online, which was amazing. And it just sort of hit a zeitgeist moment, I think. I think a few reasons for it. One is, so he talked in that and across his work, certainly about promoting the arts in education, but particularly in promoting creativity and innovation across education. And not just education, but also our businesses and the ways that we live. And he was very clear to say that while the arts obviously embody a lot of creativity, you can be creative in any subject. But shone a spotlight in particular on the fact that we really undervalue the arts across our education systems. In particular, as he put in the TED Talk, there's no system in the world that teaches dance, for example, the same way that they teach maths. And it resonated with a huge amount of people. I think it's been seen by nearly 70 million people at this point. And in particular because, so my company Nevergrey that I have with my husband, we receive a lot of his submissions, and people who get in contact with him, they get in contact with him through Viarsally, or they used to. The overwhelming feedback we had from his work was that it made people realize there wasn't a problem with them, it was a problem with the system. I think that's why it resonated so much. So that was Dad, and he passed away suddenly in August of 2020. So we're now dedicated to continuing his legacy and his work.
I obviously watched the TED Talk, and it was inspirational, insightful, but also incredibly funny. So I get the sense that your dad was quite a sort of a funny character, but also that sort of put people at ease and really sort of drew them to the actual sort of essence of the point he was trying to make. And those things are still sort of relevant and still quite urgent right now, especially in these sort of times. And especially in regards to the concept of sort of creative education. So as you said, he sort of rose to fame, he was knighted and became known around the world. But he also became disabled when he was around sort of 5, and that he wore calipers. And like I did actually, because of that, moved into sort of special school. And I was just thinking whether you think his experience of being in special school impacted upon his views around sort of education. You know, in his TED Talks, he talks about eliminating the hierarchy of subjects, which I know he's spoke about many times. And from my own experience in special school, that hierarchy actually didn't exist.
Dad was one of 7 kids from Liverpool. When he got polio, he got it when he was 4. And he, at the time, his 2 younger siblings, his 2 younger brothers hadn't been born. So he was at the time the youngest of 5 siblings when he contracted polio. And it was the 1950s. So it was the middle of, there was a lot of polio around in the 1950s. But they think, because nobody else in his family got it, which is somewhat miraculous, they think that he got polio because he had a speech impediment and he was going to a speech therapist. And they reckon he actually got polio from the speech therapists. Which is one of the other reasons why it's so incredible that he went on to become such a prolific speaker, because his speech impediment was so bad as a child that he actually couldn't speak. And so that's how they think he got polio. And he had, as you said, he was in hospital for, I think, 8 months. And he wore calipers that they went all the way up his leg, on both legs for a long time. But then he wore it on one leg. And this is ridiculous because he was my dad and it's sort of been a running joke in the family. I can't tell you which leg it was. I think it was his right leg, but it's one of those ones when you grow up and it's your dad, you don't notice, that's just dad. So I think it was his right leg. But it was, and if you wore calipers, you'll know he wore the same model, not the same one obviously because he grew, but the same model that he was fitted in the 1950s up until he died. So, and it weighed about 10 pounds. It was metal, with leather, but it was this proper massive weight, which I mentioned because he never talked about it that much. I mean, he talked about having polio, but you never would have known that on top of everything else he was carrying around. I mean, I would if it was me, and it hurt, which I just find is incredible. But in terms of his experience at the school that he went to, I mentioned he was one of 7 families because the family in Liverpool, where my granddad worked on the docks, and it was sort of expected that everyone he grew up right next to Everton football ground, so everyone thought he'd be the footballer of the family, and actually his 2 younger brothers did go on to become footballers for Everton. I mention it because it was expected in the family that you'd go on to sort of do work on the docks or do some form of manual labour the way that their father did, although my granddad was quadriplegic from a docking accident for 19 years until he passed away. But because Dad obviously then had his calipers and couldn't do the manual work, his father put an emphasis on him to say you have to focus on your education in a way that I'm not sure he did with his siblings. And that, I think, is what played a huge role in him going on to do what he did, this feeling that he couldn't play football like his brothers did, and he couldn't, take after his dad and go and work on the dock. So really, what was he going to do? I'm interested to hear you say that you felt like there was more of a diverse curriculum or freedom in the school that you went to. And he didn't mention that there would be more arts or inclusivity. I think he mentioned that there was just a lot less pressure. They sort of had no expectations of any of the kids in the class. And there was a man who came round who sort of came to visit the school, and picked Dad out and said, I think he could pass the 11 plus. And he did. And that's how he then went on to be into a mainstream school. So you found, Daryl, because you went to a special school, like you said, and then got transferred into mainstream education. Was that a big shock for you then, if you'd had a bit more sort of exposure to the arts and creativity when you went?
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting what you're saying. I think nowadays the sort of approach to sort of teaching in special schools is more sort of broad. But I think even in my experience, it would have been in the sort of late 70s, early 80s, there was this sort of level of, well, there's no expectation.
Right.
So actually, why bother
That.
teaching them maths? Why bother teaching them English when actually we don't assume that they're going to sort of progress or do anything? For me, it was much more around that sort of freedom of the as an individual in that school to sort of not worry about learning maths and learning English and all of that, which when I went back into mainstream was a problem. And again, it goes back to this sort of hierarchy of subjects and education, that I have to do it in a very sort of fixed way that the system has put in place. But even then, when I was back into mainstream, there was still this sort of attitude that, you know, well, he's not really going to sort of be able to do anything. So there were some times when they were just like, oh, what should we do with Daryl? Or let him just do a bit of art. And I still say to this day that the only reason that I'm working theatre and a theatre maker is because I'm disabled, because otherwise I wouldn't have been allowed to focus so much of my time, or forced to focus so much of my time in those subjects. And in my case, I was just allowed to do the soft subjects, such as, you know, drama and art.
Yeah, well, it's the same thing. Dad said that if he hadn't had polio, he wouldn't have done what he ended up doing, because he wouldn't have been pushed to focus on his more. And actually, he was an interesting case given the work that he did do, because the mainstream system actually worked very well for him. He went on to teach at university. He was in and of himself actually very academic.
I know. Well, therein lies the sort of other sort of thing. So, you know, I ended up taking a very traditional education route. I did my A-levels, I went to university. The sort of experiences I had at special school actually did really sort of frame my sort of approach, how people are educated. So that's why I also sort of worked to establish IAN, the International Inclusive Arts Network. And that's really around sort of celebrating those other disabled artists, to place that front and center to other young disabled audiences, but also we shouldn't be sort of pigeonholed into being those sort of role models for other disabled young people. Actually, it's everybody, actually. So disabled or not, you should be able to see disabled artists creating work. So you mentioned that sort of Ken sadly passed away last year, and it must be still very sort of raw for you in that. But his memory lives on in so many ways. So tell us how it's living on.
We're 6 months into this journey. And so Anthony, my husband, and I, we've got our company Nevergrey. And we worked as Dad's head office for the last, since 2016. I worked with him separately before that. So we're finding our feet a bit, because we weren't in the legacy business before, but we are now. And when we found out that Dad wasn't going to get better, he had a very short illness, I promised him that we would continue his work, which is what we were doing anyway. We just thought, I keep joking, it's not a very funny joke at all, but I keep saying he's left us with a bit more autonomy than we were expecting. We thought we'd have him steering us along the way, but a few things that have really, there's been such an outpouring of love since he passed away, which is incredible. And it is, you mentioned at the start about how funny he was. And I think so much of what resonated about Dad in particular was what he was saying is so critically important. But how he was saying it, as you said, it made people relax. So, they didn't feel like they were being talked down to. I remember asking him what his secret was for public speaking, and he said, you just go out and talk to people. You rather than sort of going out and presenting, or sort of, you just go out and have a chat, because it's a room full of people. Dad's legacy lives on in the people who were inspired by him, more than anything. And it sounds almost cliche to say it, but people watched that TED talk, and there were 3 TED talks in total. People really centered around the first one. And they did things like they took their kids out of schools that were damaging them, or they quit their jobs that were toxic, or they went off in search of their element, which was one of his books. The Element was about finding your passion. And, they realized they were living for the weekends. They went off to find out what it was. And they started schools and groups and all, he'd be the first to say he didn't start a movement. He was a voice in a movement. He was just a very articulate and well-spoken voice, I think, in that movement. So in terms of our continuing his legacy, I think the first thing is that I know we're not alone in doing it, and it would be silly to think that we were. The second thing to say is that, his legacy would live on whether or not I was involved in it. And so if I am getting involved, I've got a job to not mess it up. And the third is really, I think it's about pulling people together to say it's our turn now. it's our turn to carry on his work. So we have a number of initiatives. The first is Imagine If, which is this, which is inspired by Dad talked about how we don't live in the world as other creatures do. We create the worlds in which we live, and we do that through our power of imagination. And as you said, the Dad's TED Talk is still relevant. It's the work he did is still relevant. All Our Futures from '99 is terrifyingly relevant still. And at this point, in particular, with the pandemic and just where we are, we need his message. I really think more than ever. He put in his book Out of Our Minds. The more, I'm going to butcher this quote, bear with me. He put, the more complex the challenges of the world become, the more we need creative solutions to address them. I'm paraphrasing, but it was like that. The problems we're facing are so complex. So we've got Imagine If, which is a provocation to reimagine the world as it is, because if we created it, these systems we take for granted, whether it's our systems of education or our systems of democracy or how we structure our cities, we take it for granted that that's just the way it is, but they're human-made systems. It could be anything from imagine if we did value dance as much as maths, to imagine if every building was accessible for everybody. And that's something with Dad, you wouldn't think about it, I don't think, necessarily, unless you experience it. But Dad had in his contract for speaking engagements that he had to have a handrail with a step up to the stage, because otherwise he couldn't get on the stage. It was uncanny how many times that just was missed off. And they literally, my favorite excuses were, it's just a small step. And Dad was like, it doesn't matter how big the step is, it's a mountain to me. So it could be, imagine if everywhere was accessible for everybody. But it's a provocation to really take stock of what it is that we just take for granted that no longer serves us. Yeah, so Imagine If is a provocation to reimagine the world. Imagine if we did things differently. Do you have a statement that you'd like to add? Your reimagining for the world?
My Imagine If would be, imagine if we shared responsibility. And the reason I sort of say that is because I always talk about that actually to make the world a more inclusive and accessible place to be, then we all need to share responsibility in that. It can't just be the responsibility of me as a disabled person. I think it just spans much wider than that. I think, what if we all shared responsibility in climate change? What if we all shared responsibility in the way that our countries are governed? I think if actually individuals as human beings, we accepted, even though it might not be directly impacting us, what if we shared the responsibility to make it different?
I love that. That's a beautiful one. That is the core of Imagine If. Dad had moved away sort of a long time actually from talking directly to governments. His whole thing was about the grassroots movement, about empowering people. He'd say that rock and roll wasn't a government-led initiative. It was a people-made movement. And you're right. We far too often delegate, don't we, responsibility to other people. Sharing responsibility, there's something incredibly empowering in that. That by doing that, we can actually make something different.
Thank you. Well, thanks so much, Kate, for being with us today and sharing some memories of your dad and to find out more about Imagine If. And yeah, it's just been a real pleasure and joy to sort of chat to you today. Well, we hope that Imagine If is a huge success, and I'm sure it will be. And yeah, best wishes from all of us at IAN and Azatej UK. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Produced by Vicky Island, co-founder IAN. Many thanks to Kate Robinson, Nevergrey, nevergrey.org, Daryl Beeton, Daryl Beeton Productions, darylbeeton.com, the team at IAN, ian.online.